Chapter 14, The Rhododendron. One Saturday I was at Phoebe's again. Her father was golfing and her mother was running errands. Mrs. Winterbottom had read out a long list to us of where she would be in case we needed her. She almost did not go because she did not want to leave Phoebe and me alone, but Phoebe promised to keep all the doors locked and not to open for anyone. If we heard any noises at all, we were supposed to call the police immediately. After you call the police, Mrs. Winterbottom said, call Mrs. Cadaver. I think she's home today. I'm sure she would come right over. Oh, sure, Phoebe whispered to me. That's about the last person I would call. Phoebe imagined that every noise was the lunatic sneaking in or the message leaver creeping up to drop off another anonymous note. She was so jumpy that I began to feel uneasy too. After her mother left, Phoebe said, Mrs. Cadaver works odd hours, doesn't she? Sometimes she works every night for a week, straggling home when most people are waking up. But sometimes she works during the day. She's a nurse, so I guess she works different shifts, I said. That day, Mrs. Cadaver was home, puttering around in her garden. We saw her from Phoebe's bedroom window. Actually, puttering is not the best word. What she was doing was more like slogging and slashing. Mrs. Cadaver hacked branches off of trees and hauled these to the back of her lot, where she lumped them in a pile of branches, which she had hacked off last week. I told you she was as strong as an ox, Phoebe said. Next, Mrs. Cadaver slashed and sliced at a pitiful rose bush, which had been trying to creep up the side of her house. Then she sheared off the tops of the hedge, which bordered Phoebe's yard. She moved on to a rhododendron bush, which she was poking and prodding when a car pulled into her driveway. A tall man with bushy black hair leaped out and, seeing her, he practically skipped back to where she was. They hugged each other. Oh, no, Phoebe said. The man with the bushy black hair was Mr. Berkway, our English teacher. Mrs. Cadaver pointed to the rhododendron bush and then at the axe, but Mr. Berkway shook his head. He disappeared into the garage and returned with 2 shovels. Then he and Mrs. Cadaver gouged and prodded and tunneled all around in the dirt until the poor rhododendron hopped onto its side. Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway lugged the bush over to the opposite side of the yard where there was a mound of dirt. Phoebe's doorbell rang. Come with me, Phoebe said. But I want to watch Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway. I'm not answering the door alone, Phoebe said. I went with her. We looked out the window. No one's there, I said. We're not supposed to open the door. But no one's there, I said. I flung open the door. No one was on the porch. I put one foot on the porch and looked up and down the street. Quick, Phoebe said. Get back in here. Maybe someone is in the bushes. I pulled my foot back inside. We closed the door and locked it. By the time we returned to Phoebe's bedroom window, Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway had replanted the bush. Maybe there's something hidden under the bush, Phoebe said. Like what? Like a dead body. Maybe Mr. Berkway helped her chop up her husband and bury him, and maybe they were getting worried and decided to disguise the spot with a rhododendron bush. I must have looked skeptical. Phoebe said, Sal, you never can tell. And Sal, I don't think you or your father should go over there anymore. I certainly agreed with her on that one. Dad and I still had been there 2 nights earlier, and I had hardly been able to sit still. I started noticing all these frightening things in Margaret's house. Creepy masks, old swords, books with titles like Murder on the Rue Morgue and The Skull and the Hatchet. Margaret cornered me in the kitchen and said, So, what has your father told you about me? Nothing, I said. Oh, she seemed disappointed. My father's behavior was always different at Margaret's. At home, I would sometimes find him sitting on his bed, staring at the floor, or reading through old letters or gazing at the photo album. He looked sad and lonely, but at Margaret's, he would smile, and sometimes even laugh, and once she touched his hand, and he let her hand rest there on top of his. I didn't like it. I didn't want my father to be sad, but at least when he was sad, I knew he was remembering my mother. So when Phoebe suggested that my father and I should not go to Margaret's, I was quite willing to agree with that notion. When Phoebe's mother came home from running all her errands, she looked terrible. She was sniffling from blowing her nose. Phoebe asked her if she was sick. Mrs. Winterbottom looked at Phoebe and then straight at me. "No," she said. "I think I have an allergy." Phoebe said that we were going to do some homework. Upstairs I said, maybe we should have helped her put away the groceries. "She likes to do it by herself," Phoebe said. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure," Phoebe said. "I've lived here my whole life, haven't I?" I asked Phoebe if her mother really had allergies. "Well, gosh, Sal, if she says she does, I guess she does. She's not the sort of person to lie." "Maybe something is wrong. Maybe something is bothering her." "Do you think she would say so then? Don't you think she would say so then?" "Maybe she's afraid to," I said. I wondered why it was so easy for me to see that Phoebe's mother was worried and miserable, but Phoebe couldn't see it. Or if she could, she was ignoring it. Maybe she didn't want to notice. Maybe it was too frightening a thing. I started wondering if this was how it had been with my mother. Were there things I didn't notice? Phoebe sat straight in her chair and said, "Sal, I can assure you that my mother would not be afraid to say if something was bothering her. What on earth would she have to be afraid of? We are not exactly a family of lunatics, you know." Later that afternoon, when Phoebe and I went downstairs, Mrs. Winterbottom was talking with Prudence. Do you think I lead a tiny life?" she was asking. "How do you mean?" Prudence asked as she filed her nails. "Do we have any nail polish remover?" Phoebe's mother retrieved a bottle of nail polish remover from the bathroom. "What I was wondering," Phoebe's mother said, "was if you think—" She stopped talking when she saw me and Phoebe. "Oh," Prudence said to her mother, "before I forget, do you think you could sew up the hem on my brown skirt so I could wear it tomorrow?" "Oh, please." Prudence tilted her head to the side and tugged at her hair exactly the same way Phoebe does. Prudence smushed up her mouth into a little pout. In the kitchen, I said to Phoebe, "Doesn't Prudence know how to sew?" "Of course she does," Phoebe said. "Why do you ask?" "I was just wondering why she doesn't sew her own skirt." "Sal," Phoebe said, "if you don't mind me saying so, I think you're becoming ever so critical." Before I left Phoebe's that day, Mrs. Winterbottom handed Prudence her brown skirt with the newly sewn hem, and all the way home I wondered about Mrs. Winterbottom and what she meant by living a tiny life. If she didn't like all the baking and cleaning and jumping up to get bottles of nail polish remover and sewing hems, why did she do it? Why didn't she tell them to do some of these things themselves? Maybe she was afraid there would be nothing left to do, or nothing left for her to do. There would be no need for her, and she would become invisible, and no one would notice. When I got home that day, my father handed me a package. "It's from Margaret," he said. "What is it?" "I don't know. Why don't you open it?" Inside was a blue sweater. I put it back in the box and went upstairs. My father followed me. Sal, do you like it?" "I don't want it," I said. "She was just trying to—" "She likes you." "I don't care if she likes me or not," I said. My father stood there looking around the room. "I want to tell you something about Margaret," he said. "Well, I don't want to hear it," I said. I was feeling so completely ornery. When my father left the room, I could still hear my own voice saying, "I don't want to hear it." And I knew that I sounded exactly like Phoebe.